Hi, everyone. Welcome to the 19th session of our live talk. Today, I'm here with Raymond Sun. Welcome, Ray, to the.
Hey, Luiza. Thank you.
So, Ray, for those who don't know, he is based in Australia, correct? And is it Sydney or Melbourne?
That's right, Sydney.
Sydney. And Ray he's a lawyer. He's also a developer, so he has the best of both worlds. So we poor lawyers, we usually don't know how to code. So Ray has this magic power. So he has both sides of, so the technical and the legal side. And he's also the creator of the famous AI Global Regulation Tracker. So you can see under his name here if you haven't checked yet. So it's an excellent tool, and I've recommended it in the newsletter. So if you want to stay up to date with regulation in other countries, so beyond the US and the EU, you should absolutely bookmark his regulation tracker. And also you have a newsletter, right, Ray? You want to invite?
That's right. Yeah, it's all linked in the tracker. It's all in there.
The tracker. So if you go to the tracker, you're going to also find his newsletter, also a great way. Before we start with the specific topics, I want to remind you, so if you want to stay up to date with the next, so first with the latest developments in AI compliance, policy, and regulation, also subscribe to my newsletter. And if you want to join the AI governance training, so the November cohort, the 13th cohort of my 4-week training program, so save your spot. It will start in the first week of November, so there are still places, so you can still register. Now let's get started. So first, before we go to the country, so I added the flag so to let people know that we're talking about other countries. But before we start, I want to know about Ray's story. So first, by the way, I was checking your LinkedIn, Ray, and I saw that you won this lawyers under 30 in best tech lawyer under 30 in Australia. It was last year, right?
That's right, last year, yes.
Exciting. Congratulations. I'm proud to be here with you. So such an amazing achievement. So congratulations.
Thank you. Yeah.
And how did you start? So how the idea, when and how, what's the story behind the Global AI Regulation Tracker? How did you come up with the idea?
Yeah, well, first of all, hello everyone, and thank you so much for bringing me onto your podcast show, Luiza. You're one of the most respected and widely known voices on AI regulation, AI governance. So really happy and honored to be on the same platform with you right now. Yeah. So my story with building this tracker, to start, I'll start with like my story into AI because I think that makes sense. So I've always been fascinated with robots ever since I was a kid. I love watching shows like Astro Boy, Robots the movie, Thomas the Tank Engine, anything that's got to do with machines, robots, and engines and trains. I really love that. So throughout my whole childhood, I love just anything to do with automation. I didn't know there was a thing called AI back then. I just thought it was around robots. Until in high school, I started to, I was at the age where I could read and research. That's where the concept of AI came to mind. I was also at that time where I was really interested in watching Iron Man, where it was, for me, that was the most inspirational form of AI, having your own personal assistant that can pretty much do anything for you. And at the same time, I was also into reading detective stories, crime scenes and novels. So that's how I got interested in the idea of law and justice. And so I was dabbling between both legal and tech as my sort of career choice. Eventually settled with doing law as a career and doing like coding as a hobby. And I've started to learn code since high school to build my own video games and my own apps. It was really around uni when I started to learn how to build websites, learn how to build mobile apps. I also started to learn things around machine learning just to really recreate my own version of Iron Man's Jarvis. Until during COVID, where it was lockdown, I had a lot of time at home to just do anything. I thought that's where I spent a lot of time using AI to help solve some of my own personal use cases. My most well-known use case was when I used AI to analyze dances. So basically, it will I built a program that could analyze a dance video, and you upload your own dance video to the program, and it will then compare the two videos to see how similar you dance to the original dancer. And I made a video on that on YouTube. It got pretty viral, and then I applied that algorithm to analyze K-pop dancers, and it got viral throughout Asia. And that kind of kickstarted my whole social media journey on YouTube, just being that guy who uses AI to analyze K-pop. So you can kind of see how all of these things are coming together, being a lawyer in my job, building AI on the side, and also starting my own social media hustle. And it all came together when I was researching more on AI. Often topics of AI regulation will pop up in my search. And we're talking about 2019, 2020, when the idea of AI regulation wasn't still very popular. That's around the time when the EU AI Act started to be drafted. And so that caught my interest. And whenever I read these materials, I'll just think, oh, I've got my own opinions to this. And as I got more opinions, I started to write them down in a notebook. And as my notebook expanded, I realized, wow, I actually have a lot of content and materials on AI regulation. And so I started going on LinkedIn as well, posting some posts and some stories on AI regulation until I got to the point where I've posted quite a lot of posts of different countries. And I wanted to just collate them in one place. And I just thought, why not just create a tracker website that just tracks every country in the world? And so I started that project around last year, and I created this map. And I just try to make it simple, like my own personal diary. You just click on a country and it just shows you a summary. Over time, I've expanded the functions and features, expanded the content, and it was really encouraging to see other people find it useful. And yeah, that's where it is today, the Global AI Regulation Tracker. Yeah.
Excellent. So the first region was the EU, I imagine. What was
the main major economies: EU, US, China, Australia.
Okay.
Yeah.
So there was not one special one that started. Basically, it was many at the same time.
Yeah, many at the same time. That's right. Yes.
And just thank you for sharing your story. And I always like to start with something. I think we are successful with things that connect with our personal stories. And this is my personal belief, that we are going to shine in the world. We are going to serve the community better if we are connected to something deep inside. If it's something fake, something that is just for the attention, just for the money, usually it doesn't last a lot, because that's not who you really are. So I love stories of how we begin, how we connect with the topic that we love.
And you mentioned just on that, like the story behind the tracker was pretty organic, but in turn, the tracker has also inspired a new journey for me, which is to really study culture and history of as many countries as possible. When I'm tracking laws, it has prompted me to also dive deep into that country's particular history, culture, the way to do business. So it's also started some sort of digital travel journey for me. So it's a very positive virtuous cycle that I found from this experience.
And before I go back to what I was saying, so on what Ray just said, so when we had this call before our live talk, and I asked, so Ray, what countries would you like to talk about? And he told me, any country, ask me anything. The whole world. I said, really, the whole world is fair game. You're comfortable. He told me exactly this. So he's passionate about world history and politics and culture and how it connects. So just a comment. It's absolutely true what he just said. But going back to the stories, each one's narrative and how we begin and we connect. So you mentioned that you started with this more, I would say, sci-fi, right? The movies and this. Machines and robots, and it's interesting. Just a side comment. So for me, was the opposite. I was never interested in those movies. I always liked drama and people and I don't know, justice, fairness. That's why I went to law school. And what brought me to AI was kind of a different path. So I always liked the idea of fairness, of how people can be. How we can help when people are in unfair situations. That's what took me to law school. And then technology entered my journey when I saw, wow, technology can be exciting, amazing. And I remember when I had my first smartphone, it was, wow, it's a new world, right? You can see, you have data everywhere you go. But then I started paying attention, but it's not so easy. There's the other side as well. So other ways that technology can manipulate or technology can oppress. So then I saw bias, and then I saw part of my PhD research was about dark patterns. So tricks that try to make people do things that they don't want to, and other ways in which we can see the unfairness that is in the world can also be, I would say, increase with technology. So my journey, I love to hear your story. So you came from, we meet in the same, so we are here in the same live talk, but our origin stories, let's say, started from different places. Just a side comment. Now let's go back to our topic and to the countries that we said. So we're going to talk to relate So world countries and different countries to EU and US, which I think most people are more familiar with. But I want to start talking about countries which I think most in the audience are not aware or not familiar. So I have the list. So you all saw the flags in the registration document. So I want to start. I will follow the list of flags. So let's start with Australia. So the place where Ray currently is. So there was recently that report from the Asia Pacific area. So and they said I'm not sincerely, I don't know much about Australia. I've never been to Australia, so I learned a lot with that recent report. And Australia is one of the most advanced, right, in this context of AI governance and thinking forward about AI. So with you, Ray. So what would you like to share? So what's going on in Australia, and especially in the context of Oceania? So how it compares to New Zealand and to the other Pacific island? How would you explain the current state of AI governance and AI regulation in Australia?
Yeah, so I can definitely talk about Australia. Just to allow for smoother, more efficient conversation as we go through the countries. I might also talk about high-level themes that might also be applicable to other countries, so that it'll kind of make this conversation concise. So, Australia falls in the broad category of common law systems. So, as we all know, the world is pretty much largely divided into three broad legal systems: common law systems, which legal systems that partly rely on judge court cases to create the law. You have the civil law system, where rules are all codified into legislation, and then your Sharia law systems, which we see a lot in the Middle East. So Australia falls within the common law system, along with the UK, Singapore, India, and likewise. And so a typical trend with common law systems is that because they have a very not active, but that the court has a more prominent role in the place, the common law or the judge-made law plays a huge role in how we regulate things. So compared to, let's say, the European Union, where the EU AI Act mostly has its foundations in product liability. And in Europe, product liability is basically codified in full. But in Australia, product liability is split across various sources. It's split across tort law, where it deals with manufacturer liability. It's split into also consumer protection law, and it's also split into contract law. So that's an example where in a common law system like Australia, one concept can be everywhere. And imagine that for every area of law, where there's not just a statute, you also have to consider other sources. So when it comes to countries like Australia, it's quite complicated. You can't just simply say, let's just have an AI law in place. There's actually a lot of structural things to work through. And right now, how Australia is set up is that there's already a lot of existing laws, like privacy law, consumer protection law, online safety law, that broadly cover the ground with AI. And so what the government has been doing over the past few years is really just trying to work out what is the gap in these laws and how should we approach that gap, but in a way that fits within the current legal framework of Australia. And so over the past month, the most recent update was Australia proposing some mandatory guardrails around AI, particularly high-risk AI, as well as voluntary guardrails around that. And actually, the government just released all the public submissions that were made in response to that consultation. And so they're still trying to work out how they should implement those mandatory guardrails into law. But in the meantime, Australia has mostly relied on ethic frameworks. And these ethic frameworks then inform both the market practice in the private sector, as well as other various initiatives in the public sector. So there's actually quite a lot of frameworks and assurance frameworks in the public sector at both federal and state level. So when we say AI regulation Australia, we're really talking about what is going to be the next step for the private sector. So that's kind of like what Australia is in, and it's a pretty similar boat to UK, which is a bit more advanced than Australia in that sense, and also similar to New Zealand, but Australia's a bit more progressed than New Zealand. So that's how I see it. Yeah.
And in terms of, do you see this effort towards updating existing laws, so amending or no?
Yeah, there are various,
let's say, tort and civil laws, so enacting new laws or amending existing laws. What's the movement?
Yeah,
amending?
so it's mostly amending the existing laws. Right now, Australia has the privacy law reform going on. There's also the online safety law reform going on. Not so much at the common law yet, because common law is changes in common law is mostly in response to litigation, and the litigation scene in Australia is not as active compared to the US. So that's a bit slow. But there's been a lot of activity among the regulators, particularly the privacy regulator, the consumer and competition regulator, our bank sector regulator, ASIC and APRA. They're doing a lot of, whether it be guidelines or whether it be releasing statements on their positions. There's a lot of activity in that sense. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Ray. Super interesting, and I'm seeing that the audience is also following the discussion. And let's move now to another country. We have a long list to go, and this one is so many people, I'm sure, are curious about this one. So China. Let's talk about China. And when we see the global debate, there is this AI race. We'll talk more about this comparison between China and US. So how race is in terms of innovation or competition in the global arena. But China is this mystery, because I would say most people in the West don't speak Chinese. And I would say the culture is really split. So there's this cultural divide as well. So we don't know. So those two areas of the world don't communicate much in cultural terms, I would say. So it's mostly people, we don't know what's going on in China. We just imagine. And some people say, look, China they are advancing, they are leading the AI race. So we need to, and many people in the US say that if we have too much regulation, if we over-regulate, so China is just going to win the race and we are going to be bad economically. But by the way, in our list, so in the all the countries we are going to speak about today, China is the only one which has, according to, I checked also Ray's guide to see those other countries. The only one which has this AI law, so a specific AI law. So how do you see China, Ray, and especially I would say from this point of view of competition with the US? So regarding having in mind their AI law.
Yeah, so China does already have existing AI laws in place. It's different from the EU AI Act, where it's not one law that regulates all AI systems. They're very targeted laws. They've targeted three main areas, being recommendation algorithms, so algorithms that feed content to you or feed ads to you. They've regulated that. They've also regulated something called deep synthesis technology, which is basically their phrase for deep fake generators or synthetic content generation. And they've also regulated generative AI, specifically generative AI systems that are provided to the public. Now, if you look at all these three applications, you can see a common theme in them. And that common theme is all about regulating misinformation. So compared to the EU, where the AI regulation focuses more around protecting human rights, Chinese regulation of AI is more around regulating or reducing the risk of misinformation that could potentially cause individual harm or also social instability. The interesting thing about China is, again, going back to, I'm going to keep repeating this, but going back to the legal system, China is a civil law system. But the interesting thing about China is that their approach to law is meant to be iterative and experimental. So to give an example, their law on generative AI is known as the Interim Administrative Measures on Generative AI. Note the word interim. Not many countries have this sort of concept where we have an interim law. So by design, Chinese laws are meant to be easily updated over time so they can accommodate for changes. And the reason why they can do that is because Chinese lawmaking system is very efficient. It's a one-party system where often legislative and regulatory agendas are driven by central economic policy agenda. So if the central government says AI is a key priority for the economy, make sure it's safe, then everyone down below, regulators, the relevant lawmaking bodies, they'll all follow through that. And it's all part of their KPI. If they don't perform well, then that reflects badly on them. So right now, most of these AI laws are enforced by China's internet safety regulator, known as the Cyberspace Agency, and their roots are in internet safety. So you can see the misinformation being related to that internet safety role. The other key thing about China is that, along with the US, China has got a very large AI industry. They can actually manufacture AI from start to end. And so they've got a pretty unique sort of proposition where they'll have to have they've got a lot of big tech in the country. And so what might not seem to be AI law is actually regulating AI. And I'm talking about the competition law and the data protection laws. The big tech companies in China have to follow these laws, and how the regulator enforces these laws will affect big tech, and that would then affect AI development in China. So that's kind of like understanding that context can help you understand sort of the various forces at play. Yeah.
And two comments on what you said. So first, you mentioned in the same sentence, so efficient lawmaking. So for me as a Brazilian, this is unique. So when we think of lawmaking and legislative process, usually we think of something slow that is always trying to catch technology space. And you're saying that this is maybe something I have never heard of, a country that's super efficient in lawmaking and enacting new laws. So maybe that's you're telling me about China.
One other factor for the efficiency in Chinese laws is that they all share similar mechanisms and concepts. So across those 3 existing AI laws, they all share into an algorithm register. They all require some sort of pre-deployment security check. They all have some element of content moderation rules. So those mechanisms are consistent across the regulations. And I like to call this regulation scalability, where because they got the model, they can just replicate that model for any given use case that causes concern. So it's a very scalable regulatory model. Yeah.
Interesting. And you also mentioned the KPI. So, okay, so we have this AI is good for innovation, it's good for the economy, so let's do it. So it sounds efficient. Another comment on what you said, still in China. So you mentioned that the common topic is misinformation. And then probably something that we would think with this Western mentality. So what do you think China, so we have this big debate, right? What is information and misinformation? So this is controlled also by it would be a political decision in China, right? It's not something established by laws, it's a political decision. What will be considered allowed information, what you can say and what you cannot say. Those would be decided by the government.
Yeah, this partly overlaps with the current censorship laws in China. I'm not an expert in how their censorship laws work, but I can imagine all of the principles and thinking in that will have been carried over into the misinformation regulation, which includes the AI regulation. Yeah.
I see. Interesting. I think from a Western perspective, it's also different, right? So we would deal with it from, I would say, free speech, or in Europe, so different constitutional laws, so different also. Maybe this is also something that slows down, especially when you're trying to contain deep fake. And then we say, okay, but if we block it too much, and then we are blocking too much freedom of speech, which would be something seen as we cannot do that. And maybe that's also different. Next country we have is Egypt. So I have almost no knowledge about how they are regulating AI and what's currently going on. What I know, which I learned in your tracker, is that they still do not have an AI law. That's something comprehensive in this sense.
Egypt doesn't yet have an AI law in the same way as like the EU or China have. They have a ethics framework. So they've got the Egyptian Charter of Responsible AI, this is the case for many countries in the global south that don't yet have AI regulation. At this point in time, most of them have some sort of either an ethics framework, or if not an ethics framework, some sort of economic strategy or a budget paper that emphasizes the importance of AI in the economy. So Egypt falls into that bucket, along with many other African nations and also some parts of Southeast Asia. So I kind of see them as kind of part of the same progress line. One interesting thing about Egypt is I might briefly talk about Sharia law, which is kind of like which is basically a very prominent thing in the Middle East. So different Middle East countries have different levels of regard and conformity to Sharia law, but the thing about Sharia law is that it's quite a sophisticated and complicated sort of legal body of law, because it's not just about codified rules and principles, but it's also very strong social, religious, and cultural undertones within the law. And that's very interesting when you try to read AI ethic frameworks from the Middle Eastern region. You might see certain similarities, but also certain discrepancies between Middle Eastern AI ethics versus just, let's say, Western AI ethics. particularly, let's say, around automated decision making. So, for example, in Sharia law, this is based on my readings. There's a whole new body of finance law, like Islamic finance law, which has certain rules on how you can conduct loans, conduct borrowing, conduct debt, etc. And when we talk about automated decision making, one of the big use cases for that is finance, automating credit, etc. So when you see these sort of frameworks between West and Middle East around automated decision making in finance, that's when you see a lot of difference and seeing that the differences in legal system coming at play. So that's probably one thing I wanted to share that I thought was very interesting.
Super interesting. And from this maybe not only Egyptian perspective, but perhaps other countries in the global south. So you said they mostly rely on these ethics frameworks. And how does it so far, right? They still do not have something of, I would say, hard law on the topic. From your perspective, is it working well? So let's think about beyond the piece, the legislative piece itself. So from in terms of policy making and what's going on in AI, do you see the latest development as something that is working, or they're looking forward, or they are expecting to have soon an AI law? So they feel the need to have something more structured and more as this traditional hard law on the topic.
Yeah, that's a very good question. It's very hard to assess effectiveness just purely based on ethics framework. From just as an outsider, ethics framework is just kind of like more of a milestone. It's just a benchmark to say, okay, you've now done this stage. What's going to be next for you? Ethics frameworks become useful in understanding how aligned is the world on common principles. So at this point in time, there's pretty much universal consensus on what AI ethics should be. Being transparent, making sure you respect privacy, making sure if AI goes wrong, there's someone accountable for that. So these sort of ideas are pretty much universal. They've all been now codified in various United Nations sort of documents. So it's really at this point, what's really the key thing to see is how does each country interpret that ethic, and then how much of that ethic influences the activity of their regulators, and also the priority or agenda of their lawmaking bodies. So one example which I already mentioned is like the differences between Middle Eastern AI ethics versus Western AI ethics. You could also say the same for Asian AI ethics, particularly China. One of the common AI ethics that we talk about or see is AI security. Now, in the Western world, security often tends to mean like, cybersecurity. It's like the actual physical sanctity of a data and make sure it's safe. But in Chinese, the relevant term for security is anquan. But when you translate it, it has two potential meanings: security and safety. Now, in Chinese, security and safety are under the one term, so they treat that together the same. But in the West, AI security and AI safety are completely different things. AI safety is basically making sure your AI system doesn't cause harm or doesn't hurt anybody. And AI security is making sure your AI is safe from attacks, etc. So two very separate bodies of thinking. And so that's why I find very interesting that even though we have the same label on an ethic principle, the actual enforcement can be very different, or the actual interpretation can be very different. So, yeah.
And just building up on what you just said, so, and also in the West, we have more ramifications. So we have also another level of polarization. So we have the AI safety people, which now in the West, I mean, people talking about AGI or killer drones or using AI to build the next pathogen that will cause the next pandemic. So this is a kind of massive event. So this AI that maybe we still do not have. So when is AGI coming? And then there is in this. So this would be the AI safety people. And the other side of the harm or risk are those people which I would say more thinking about fundamental rights, so real world harms, bias, transparency, privacy, which are things that we can have examples now. And we, so maybe that you were mentioning this the terminology and the nuances in China. So maybe they don't. I'm not sure if they have also what I see a lot in the West. So there is this polarization. So some people, they say, I don't care about AGI or safety, or it might happen, but regulation should deal with what's happening now. And for example, that's what we see in the AI Act, so risk-based approach based also on the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights, and then the safety as something that might happen, and people do not know exactly when will happen. So I think it's nice to if you want to comment.
That's interesting, because I recently visited China, Shanghai and Beijing, and sorry, not Shanghai, Beijing, Shenzhen, and then just observing there, I feel like the AI hype in China is not as loud or as crazy as we see in the West, and this is my conjecture, but I think it's because Chinese people are a bit more used to seeing AI in their everyday life. When you go to an airport, train station, shopping center, a lot of things are like smart tech. A lot of things already been automated for your convenience, which, as a person from Australia, when I go there, I'm like, wow, this is so advanced. But to them, they've used to that for like a decade. And so because right now, this whole generative AI hype is really starting from language models. So from Chinese perspective, language model, it's impressive, but it's not super crazy leap. And that probably informs a bit more grounded and pragmatic perspective towards AI, whether it be around AGI or AI regulation. That's just my theory. I could be wrong, but that's just my observation.
Very
just being on the ground
hearing
recently.
from people who visit China says, listen, Westerners, they must go to China and see by themselves. They think China is maybe in the past, but China is in the future. So I hear from many people coming back from let's move on in our list. So the next one is India. So such an important country. No regulation so far, and from what I was following last year, the debate, so around is there going to be, so it looks like nothing in the perspective yet, right?
It depends on how you define nothing. If we're talking about just hard AI specific law, then yeah, nothing. But India's sort of trajectory so far has been very, very interesting. Past 2 years, their government was pretty clear in saying that we won't regulate AI. We want to make our AI market catch up with the other major powers.
Exactly.
But since last year, they're sort of changing their position to say, okay, we might need to start taking some steps. The interesting thing about India is that even before all of this, they have an IT Act, the IT Act 2000, which has been regulating the information technology space to an extent. But they also had some lacking in privacy law. So over the past year, they're working very hard to bolster their privacy law regime. And as part of that, they're also looking into digital safety. And as part of that, they also plans to replace the IT Act with something else, which is called the Digital India Act. So they've got these other ancillary laws going on to regulate the tech sector broadly. And so when AI comes in, it's sort of similar to China, where they're mostly focused on AI for the purposes of misinformation risk. And that became very prominent earlier this year due to the election. And this is a very common theme across many countries this year. 2024 is like the election year for so many countries. You can see the theme where an election year, there's a lot of focus on deep fakes and misinformation and threats to democracy. You have that sort of theme going around. And so India is also part of that, caught in that sort of trend. Since the election, the conversation around AI has slightly quieted down, but we're still seeing statements released from time to time. The key driver in India is really the IT ministry, the Ministry of Electronics and IT. Their personnel often go to events to talk about incoming AI regulation. It's been reported that they're currently drafting an AI regulatory framework, but we still don't really know what that looks like. So I think India is still a TBC. Yeah.
And you mentioned that the deepfake regulation, both in China, India, and now you see in the US, so state laws, so various state laws covering deepfake. So we saw only in September, I saw that California enacted 17 new bills related to various forms of generative AI regulation, but it's intense regulation in this sense, at least at the state level in the US. Moving to Japan. So recently, last week, we had this I posted it, and so many people were happy to read. So the document from the AI Safety Institute in Japan. So they released the document on red teaming, and people discovered this institute, and they were happy to hear more, and etc. So also maybe because of the language barrier, so many people in the West don't know what's happening in Japan. And according to your tracker, so there is a proposal, but not finalized yet. So is there anything interesting happening? Something that maybe we can relate to our topic?
When I talk about Japan, I think it's important to recognize both their role in domestic and global AI. Starting with domestic, yeah, they don't have a hard AI law in place. They've got a lot of frameworks, they've got a lot of guidelines, they've got an AI ethics framework. So they've got a lot of these foundational documents set up. And it's been reported that I think before the election, the government was working on drafting some AI regulation, but I'm not too sure where that's now after the election that has just happened. But the general consensus is that Japan's really going for pro-business AI regulation. So they want to make sure, because when you read the actual news statements and the government forums, they're analyzing the US and the EU market very closely, and they want to make sure that Japanese AI regulation is not as stringent as those two. So they want to maintain competitiveness. Japan's also quite unique because their hardware robotics industry is very well known, similar to South Korea. Japan's also got a very vibrant content media industry, like anime fans might know. So a lot of probably one of the more active regulators is the copyright, the intellectual property space, where they've played a key role in releasing guidance and statements to clarify whether you can or cannot use third-party content for training. So that's all domestic. On the global side, Japan's played a very key role in the G7. So the G7, the group of seven, covers like the top sort of rich nations in the world. Japan has really been leading the whole Hiroshima process, which is a broad process for many other issues, but it has also included AI. And they've produced a code of conduct that can be adopted across the G7 nations on how to safely manage high-risk systems. So Japan's playing a very key leader role in the G7 side. So I think that's something to make note of.
And regarding Japan, so we have friends who have returned recently, and what I hear from people, maybe it's not the official government policy, is that the Japanese people, or sectors in the Japanese people, they are frustrated because Japan was such a leader, tech leader 30 years ago, and now it's a bit slower pace. So they're trying to catch up now. So it will also influence how they regulate AI. So maybe it relates. You see some sort of connection with that. That we have at least I learned at school the Japanese method. So a few decades ago, and now we don't hear so much from Japan. So China is much more accelerated their technology pace than Japan. So do you see that influencing how they think about regulation or no?
Yeah, like I think part of the reason why AI doesn't sound as big coming from Japan compared to, let's say, China or Korea is because the software industry in Japan is not as, I guess, prominent compared to the software industry in South Korea and China. And a lot of the AI applications we're talking about are already software based. But when it comes to hardware, that's where Japan does play a really leading role. But that's when I like to compare between South Korea and Japan, because I feel like they're often seen as parallels because they're very hardware focused, robotics focused. I think the key thing about South Korea is that they can produce chips. Like that's one of the key advantages. Japan can, but in terms of just the global supply chain, we're really talking about Taiwan and South Korea and China and US building chips. But the semiconductor space, that's where South Korea has a bit of an edge over Japan. And so a lot of the AI conversation is sort of rooted in that. Also, South Korea, if we're talking about which country has had the first AI law, if we're talking like real, it's not the EU, it's not China. I think it's actually South Korea. Because South Korea, they've got a law since 2008 regulating intelligent robots. So they've got that in place since 2008, which not many people know of, but they've had their robotics industry very much set in place, and that sort of law is quite broad to cover AI. And so they've got that sort of head start compared to Japan. So, but the thing is that South Korea hasn't had much of a prominent role in the global AI lawmaking space compared to Japan. Although South Korea, their online safety regulator is working a lot with other online safety regulators in the deep fake and online safety space. Actually, it was like last week where South Korea, no, not last week, end of September, where South Korea passed a law that basically bans creation and even just consumption of deepfake pornography, which is quite
Yeah,
early in this space right now.
yeah.
So that's interesting.
And glad that you mentioned robots. We have this from this Western, perhaps naive approach. You think of robots, advanced robots, and anthropomorphized robots. You think of Japan. So I'm glad you mentioned. And you mentioned also copyright. So last year, I probably saw this news. So there is this national competition in Japan, right? The best book. And the winner, this woman, she said publicly that 5%, I think it's 5% or 10%, I think 5%, of her book she wrote with ChatGPT, and that caught my attention. So she publicly said that. So probably other people are doing that, but she said, yes, 5% of my book was written by ChatGPT. Wow. And there were no. So she still got the National Literature Prize in Japan. So just because you mentioned. And now that we have this discussion, so if you use AI to produce your work, can it be protected by copyright law? So that I remember this story from Japan. So now let's move on. Let's take a plane to the other side of the world, and let's talk about Mexico. So I'm also unaware of recent developments, so we don't hear much about Mexican developments in AI. Is there something interesting, something memorable about Mexico?
Yeah, not just Mexico, but just South America in general. Like, I feel like South America is a bit underreported in the AI governance and regulation space. So, Mexico, what we know so far from news is that they are currently having a draft law in place, a law for ethical regulation of AI since 2013. But I'm not too sure where has that landed. So I'm still on the outlook for that. But I think just to go broader, I feel like South America is such a fascinating market to study, because I think this is kind of preempting your next question on Brussels effect and the EU AI Act. Out of all the continents in the world, the South American market is, a lot of them are adopting similar styles to the EU AI Act. But when you compare Brazil to Chile to Mexico to Argentina's sort of own respective drafting of their AI bill, they've got very different variations and very different interpretations of the EU AI Act. And that makes me think a lot about how influential is the EU AI Act actually. Many people compare the EU AI Act as the next GDPR. The GDPR, when it came through, it was so good that everyone basically adopted it. If you don't adopt it, you're basically behind, or you're going to cause yourself hassle. So that's where sort of the Brussels effect term really became prominent. But when I actually look at the EU AI law and see how other countries reacted to it, including how Japan has reacted to it, how South America reacted to it, many countries they like the idea of a risk-based framework. So the EU AI Act prohibited risk, high risk. A lot of countries like that idea. But the actual drafting and the format of the law is not that popular compared to what many people think. And so when I read the South American bills, a lot of them are adopting the risk-based framework, but they're rejecting a lot of the very strict mechanisms and drafting of the EU AI law. And this is not just coming from me. This is also coming from Argentina's president, who months ago said that they want to make Argentina like a global hub for AI investment and business, especially in the region, and they're openly going to go for less stringent rules compared to the EU. And so I find that as a pretty tangible sort of case study to show that the EU AI Act might not be as consequential as many people make it out to be, but I could be very wrong. Who knows? Yeah.
No, it's we are going to discuss that, and I'm glad that you brought this topic now. And I've been reading some papers recently about people who say, no, the Brussels effect, it happened with the GDPR. So many of the core concepts of the GDPR, so consent or the principles in data subject rights, they were reflected in other laws. So we thought that, wow, Europe is really exporting regulation. So maybe they don't export so many advancements in technology, but they definitely export regulatory approaches. So we had that with the GDPR. For those in the audience that are not from the legal field, so GDPR stands for General Data Protection Regulation. So it's the EU data protection regulation, which was highly influential. So it was approved in 2016, and so far we still see the Brussels effect happening in recent enforcement. You mentioned Latin America, so for example Brazil, so kind of following the EU, trying to push companies such as Meta to be more strict with data protection compliance, also in the AI context. So a little bit of what Ray was saying, but it's nice to hear that you. And when you compare privacy and data protection with AI, so one thing is to regulate privacy. So we have this kind of new or Western approach of privacy as a fundamental right, so data protection as part of this new wave of digital rights, or something that is important. It should have, I would say, priority. But AI, privacy is not a technology. So I would say it's a way to see data as something of a fundamental right. And when we think about AI here, it's different. We are regulating tech, and there is money involved, and there is this global race towards being the AI leader. So those are two very different topics: regulating data protection and regulating AI. So it's interesting, and I've been reading other experts saying the same thing. So no, don't be so excited. There is not such an incentive to regulate AI. So what's the incentive to win a medal for being the champion of fundamental rights? Not so. Maybe Europe is interested in that, but not so many countries. So there are other priorities. So you're mentioning the Argentinian president, so super liberal. My guess is that he will be more a hands-off approach to regulation. So I'm glad that you brought it. So now that we are bringing the topic, so Brussels effect, AI Act. Do you think? Let's do this parenthesis here. So you don't think? What's your overall opinion? So are we going to see a Brussels effect or not going to see, in your opinion?
I think it depends if the EA Act changes. I think there's a lot of right now it's a bit also early to say, because there's still going to be a lot of guidances and materials being released to help supplement the interpretation of the EA Act. A lot of these comments are already being made because some of the drafting in the Act is a bit unclear. One example is the whole thing around general purpose AI models, and when you fine tune. So let's say you're using a third-party general purpose AI model and you fine-tuned it, then under the EA Act, you could be considered a provider to the extent of the fine-tuning. But the AI Act doesn't really specify what's the threshold of fine-tuning to trigger those provider obligations. So that's one example of a pretty big ambiguity that's really affecting practitioners, especially. Also, the whole extraterritorial application, how it's unlike the GDPR, which is focused on whose data you're processing and where your business is based. The EU AI Act is focused on where the output of the AI system is used in the EU, which is a completely different spin. Now, there's a whole lot of concern around what if, let's say, I'm building AI in Australia and somehow my output gets used in Europe. Would that be caught under the EU AI Act? The recitals do mention around intention, so whether you intend the output to be used in the EU, but that's not actually in the actual hard operative provision. So that's another ambiguity that has really affected the perspective of the EA Act. But I'm sure these things will be ironed out. And so who knows, maybe it'll actually be very good and efficient that it might revive a Brussels effect. So I'm always open to that possibility.
My optimistic opinion here. So we have the AI office, which seems to be led by ambitious people and idealistic and people that are working hard to make it work. So there are standards also. So standards will be a good mechanism, right, to keep the law so aligned with. So you were mentioning the topic about the general purpose AI model. So the AI office overseeing it, and maybe the standards that are being prepared now, they will cover also. They will help kind of the understanding so that it matches the reality, and so that there is some sort of fairness in the distribution of the obligation in the value chain. So I'm optimistic in this sense. So let's continue with our list. So we have here, now we are traveling back again to the right of the globe. So we have Nigeria, so Africa's most populous country. And by the way, I've been writing the newsletter, so we know that the EU is always going after Meta, and there is always some European Data Protection Authority pressuring Meta not to use EU data to train AI, and then we saw Brazil doing the same. So there was this recent decision. And then I saw recently Nigeria also take the first time I saw an African country also being tough with Meta and say, hey, calm down. So not specifically regarding AI, but I'm seeing some, I'll say, regulatory proactivity here in Nigeria. So is there anything interesting that the audience should know about?
Yeah, so the whole African continent is also very complex. There's been, so I'll talk about the broader region first. So there's the African Union. So many people might not know of it, but there is the African Union, which is like a loose association of all the African states, and they're working together to produce ethic frameworks and a blueprint. So again, we're talking about ethic frameworks here. In the case of Nigeria, so this is sort of going to a bit of a dark history here, but the colonial past really shapes a particular legal system of each African nation. And so we're seeing differences between British influence systems versus French influence versus Dutch influence systems. And out of all these potential influences, it's the British influenced sort of African states that tend to be a bit more progressed in their AI regulation development. We're talking about South Africa and like Nigeria. So it's also partly related to the economic significance or the economic contribution of a particular African state in the broader region. So again, Nigeria doesn't yet have an AI law. They've got at least a national AI strategy, and various sort of ministers and regulators have come out just to talk about the importance of AI. Really broadly in Africa, there's a lot more emphasis on just using AI to really improve infrastructure and improve living standards. So this is often where we hear the term leapfrogging. For example, leapfrogging from 3G to 5G instead of going through 4G internet. A similar sense of Africa, especially if you think about the connection between China and Africa through the One Belt and One Road initiative. China's doing a lot of investment in Africa, building bridges, building rails. So I wouldn't be surprised if African nations eventually adopt Chinese-style AI laws for that alignment, for that trade consistency. So that's what I'm sort of expecting. If I have to talk about one standout nation in Africa, it will be Rwanda. They're ever since they've sort of cleaned up their own political structure, they're very progressive. Often people say Rwanda is like the Singapore of Africa, and so they've adopted very progressive economic policies. And in fact, Rwanda and Singapore have collaborated a lot together. Recently, they produced a playbook on AI for small nations. So there's a growing trend of like the small nations really working together to do things. Yeah.
Excellent. So it's a great time to transition to Singapore. So we recently saw they released I think it was earlier this year, the Model AI Governance Framework. Many people were interested in it. So saw this. We already hear a lot about from Singapore that they are advanced. They are trying to be leaders in the region and in the world as well. But I always every Sunday I post AI governance job openings, and there's always something from Singapore. Surprisingly, look really forward thinking in the context of governance. So we need to govern AI. So you seem to know a lot about Singapore and so many bridges with other countries. So how do you see the leadership that Singapore is trying to build here, and how it might influence the world from that area of the world?
Yeah, if I were to describe Singapore in one word, it would be pragmatic. A lot of their initiatives are just very practical and pragmatic. So normally when a country regulates AI, they go through this chronology: economic strategy, ethics framework, consultation, draft rules, legislation. It's like the chronology. And at the very end, once you have all the regulation in place, that's when you provide market guidance, business guidance to help people understand the law. But Singapore has kind of skipped a lot of it and just gone straight to business guidance and business support. They're one of the first nations to have like government endorsed toolkits, like actual software toolkits, like an open source library that you can download and use to assess your language model for like hallucination risk. So they got a lot of initiatives like this. They're also a champion of sandboxes, partly because a lot of big tech companies have their Asia operations headquartered in Singapore. So their location, their industry really helps with that. But it's an example of how Singapore's gone for really practical on-the-ground initiatives, which has inspired a lot of similar ideas in Dubai and also in the US. They recently launched the Dear Patra software toolkit, which resembles a lot to the Singaporean AI Verify toolkit. So yeah, Singapore, but in terms of like the legal system, very similar to the UK, very similar to Australia. No AI specific law yet, but their regulators are very active and very progressive in how they provide guidance. So that's a
You,
unique thing about Singapore.
and you
Yeah.
would say with this business focus. So it's nice that you mentioned Dubai, because now we can transition to the United Arab Emirates. So this,
Mm,
you mentioned this pragmatism and perhaps this wanting to be the business hub. Then you need to, perhaps that's the best approach, being pragmatic and
yeah.
helping business to flow. Let's say focusing more on the business side. So probably that's what we hear from the UAE as well.
Mm. Yeah, UAE, yeah, I'd say pretty similar to Singapore in terms of strategy. The thing about UAE is that they're very active in bilateral deals. They're making a lot of deals with other countries. There is some tension between how UAE siding more in the US compared to China, and so you have that sort of politics going on, which I won't talk about too much. But UAE, in terms of their documentation, they got a lot of guidance as well, a lot of frameworks, guides. They're also quite focused on finance. The finance sector is also quite progressive in how they approach AI. So that's how I see the UAE.
Thank you very much, Ray. So let's our last country of our list. So don't go yet. Thank you for the audience for staying. Don't stay. We still have a few points. We have Turkey and then two more questions. So please stay a few more minutes. Don't go yet. So we have Turkey. What's to know about AI governance or
Yeah.
AI regulation in Turkey, our last country today?
Like out of all the countries that I'm really interested in following, Turkey is really up there in my list, and it's for a few reasons, right? Turkey is like the mix of three completely different worlds. It's located in West Asia, so it's got that Asian side. Its political system, at least in terms of its modern legal system, is derived from the European Western model, but its demographic and culture is predominantly Muslim majority. So it's the intersection of three different I guess aspects. And so when I look at whatever AI approach that Turkey takes, is for me it's like an indicator of what is the more dominant force in the world. Right now, the Turkey does have a draft AI law which very much resembles the EU AI Act. And so, in that sense, okay, that might be another indicator of the Brussels effect, where the European approach is inspiring other nations. Apart from that, the Turkey has also got mostly the bare minimum for AI regulation. They've got a strategy, they've got some ethics framework, and then now got a draft AI law. So I'm keen to see whether that law will pass, yes or no. Who knows? But yeah.
Okay, thank you very much, Ray. And now I want to switch back to you, to your personal view. Are you personally optimistic about AI, and especially in the context of this? There is this spectrum, right, in the open debate about AI. So optimistic people who are thinking about self-driving cars and drones helping, that do not kill, but drones that help us, and other tools that might make our lives more productive, more efficient. We'll have more time for ourselves and so on. And other people, and okay, and in the pessimistic side, there are two types of people. Also, ones focused on AI safety, AGI. It's going to destroy all of us. That's why we need to regulate. So AGI is coming. It's bad. It's going to, if we don't act now, it's going to destroy the world. And other people who are also pessimistic, but they think it's already bad now. So we have this, it's destroying the internet. The internet is being polluted with synthetic content and misinformation and bias. So everything that is being output by the system is somehow biased, and we are losing control because all the content, there is no moderation, no human moderation, no human oversight, no transparency, and soon we'll lose control in that aspect. So we kind of have this unfair outcome, which is already happening. So how do you see yourself in this polarized debate, if you're optimistic, pessimistic, and if you use it, and how do you see yourself in this context?
I might get pretty philosophical with this now, but
You're
I'm
welcome.
both. I'm both, and my central view is that AI regulation will become boring eventually. But that's both a good thing and also a bad thing. A good thing in the sense that it's sort of similar to how we approach the internet safety, similar to how we approach batteries. When these technologies first came out, I'm sure there were similar conversations. How should we regulate that? There were conversations like this podcast talking about that, until we got to the point where, okay, we're pretty much consistent on how we're going to do this. And then right now, today, unless you're in the battery regulation space, not many people talk about battery regulation, battery standards. But it's a good thing because we now got a settled body of thinking and principles. So that could be what the fate of AI regulation might be. It might take a decade or might take 5 years or so, but there will be a point where, okay, let's now move on to the next sort of layer. That's where I kind of go into the sort of realist or maybe slightly negative bit, which is, unlike other technologies, AI being general purpose, it can be embedded into so many applications. So what I'm a bit fearful is that, especially for countries like the EU or Turkey or Japan, which are focused on AI specific law, the amount of time taken to perfect that law, it might become out of date by the time, like out of date in terms of how the market has moved. It's the very much typical, law is always behind technology sort of argument. So I feel that there's that challenge, which is why the Chinese model does seem to be the middle ground, because it is AI specific law, but they're designed to be changed very quickly to adapt what's ever come in the market. Also, I feel like AI, like, it might sound weird coming from me being the guy who likes to look at AI laws, but I'm not focused purely on AI laws. I also have to look at the big picture, how AI interacts with the metaverse, the blockchain, cryptocurrency, like all these other emerging technologies. At some point, these will all converge in some big way. It might be that will be in a whole new metaverse economy, and that's going to be a whole mind-blowing thing. And from that point, the whole idea of AI regulation might become moot, because we have to now worry about how do we regulate or conduct ourselves in the metaverse, and AI is only really a small part of that new reality. I don't know if I'm making myself clear. It's a bit abstract to talk about, but in short, I'm optimistic on AI becoming standardized in terms of regulations, but I'm also a bit uncertain as to what is the relevance of that in the next few years once every other technology now comes together to create a new world. And how do we navigate through that new world? I think that's a much bigger question. Yeah.
I think you're actually pretty optimistic from hearing you.
Okay.
And I always
Nice.
ask this question to all my guests, so your answer is pretty optimistic. And I
Nice.
like that you're also optimistic about NFT. You didn't say NFT, you said metaverse and crypto, maybe NFT. So all
Blockchain.
those hypes,
Yeah.
you think they're going to come back? They didn't die. They haven't died yet, so they will come back and kind of form
Yeah.
this regulatory space. So interesting. That it's very interesting approach. I haven't heard framed
Yeah.
this way. And our last question. So my last question. So what first your last message to the audience, so something that you want to leave the audience with. Also, where can they find you? And very important. So besides there, I hope everybody has bookmarked his AI regulation tracker. So let me post here the link so that everybody can check it and bookmark now. So I'm adding it to the chat. So everybody can bookmark and check later. So you have also there. You will also find his newsletter. So what else people can first your message and where can people find you? So besides your newsletter and the tracker,
I think message is have an open mind and respect differences, whether it be differences in culture, the way of doing things, and differences in politics. I think this is not just AI, but just broadly. There's a lot of tension going around the world, a lot of misunderstandings. I feel like as we're getting more connected now through social media and AI, I think it's a good opportunity to really grow in terms of mindset and be more open-minded. And as I said at the early beginning, like this whole exercise of collating AI laws together has also transformed me in really respecting different things and just learning. I love to eventually learn like more languages to really understand the nuances in culture. And so I'm still on that journey. But if if every one of us in the world can take that extra step, I'm sure, we'll be a much better place. Sounds very, very optimistic, but yeah, I'm just hoping that hopefully people here would, I guess, resonate with that. And yeah, my website is there. It has all my information. You can also find me on LinkedIn where I do a lot of posts, and yeah, that's it.
Thank you very much, Ray. It was a pleasure to have you. I think it was such an interesting session and so much new information here. I think for me, for the audience, I've learned a lot here in our conversation today. 2 reminders, so make sure to subscribe to Ray's newsletter. So remember, if you haven't subscribed yet to Luiza's newsletter, to also to stay up to date with AI policy, compliance, and regulation. And also, if you want to join the AI governance training in November, make sure to save your spot. So you can join. You see the website under my name, aitechandprivacy.com. You can register. You can find a link to the training program. Thank you, everyone. It was a pleasure, and I hope to see you all in the November live session again. So thank you, Ray, and see you soon. Bye-bye.
Cool. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thanks for listening. Bye. Thanks, Luiza.